Hello and welcome to SSHARC. My name is Louise. I'm the Director of the Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre, which is here in Sydney, Australia. And today we're working with an organisation that we call CHCI, but is apparently not called that. It's the Consortium for Humanities Centres and Institutes, which is based currently at the University of California, Berkeley, and is funded by largely from the Mellon Foundation. We've been working with Aaron there, and we're very pleased to put this on today to tell you about some things we've been up to. So to begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that SSHARC, which is a heritage building, SSHARC is situated on Gadigal land, which is part of the Eora Nation, which covers most of what is now known as the Sydney Basin and is bordered by three wonderful rivers, the Hawkesbury to the north, the Nepean to the west, and then the Georges River to the south. And the University of Sydney is right here in the middle of that land, and the building next to us that you can see, I like to point this out, there's a word that's etched into the foundation of the new social sciences building next to us, Garabara, which is a word that's used in Indigenous ceremony to do with the transfer of knowledge, and often involves dancing and other forms of embodied knowledge that are very important when people don't share languages. So that piece is part of the building. That's the Garabara is a piece of artwork by Robert Andrew that's been etched into that building. So it's bronze and steel that's been built into the stone there, and then it's been put through a oxidization process so that it's an accelerated deterioration process so that it mimics natural processes of deterioration. When that word first appeared, you couldn't really see it with your eye. It was very strange. You could see it through your camera, your iPhone, much more clearly than you could see it with the human eye. But across time, and even the 4 years or 5 years now that that building's been finished, you see that it keeps changing. So it's a very, I think, very beautiful evocation of knowledge transfer and the importance of time for and ingrained knowledges and their transfer. So I thought it was also nice because I think the three people we'll have speaking today represent three different elements, if these are elements, and this may be technically incorrect, but I like to think that your three elemental presences here, we've got somebody that works on earth, somebody that works on water, and somebody that works on rock. So that seems to me to also speak to that building next door. So welcome. And I think we've got another, so the reason that we're here is that with generous funding from our friends in America, we were able to put together a delegation of heritage specialists. You can see them here, Tristen, Natali, and Louise, and send them to ICOMOS, which I knew nothing about, but that my my colleague here, Nanda Jaroz, said this big thing is happening in Sydney and we should get involved. And this is how we've got involved. We sent these three people along to ICOMOS, and I'm going to ask them in a minute to tell Louise in particular, who probably has a very established relationship to ICOMOS, to tell us what this is all about. But I was very pleased to see the ICOMOS logo today for Sydney. So this occurs every 3 or 5 years, this conference, but the logo is put together from the Opera House with a Gadi flower. So the Gadi flower is part of the Gadigal Nation. So that's there too. So they're thinking about iconic elements as well. So what I'll do today is I thought I've prepared the panel a little bit. I see what I'd like to do is a first scrape across you and ask you all to introduce yourself. And maybe if you could, just to give us a snapshot of your, either the words that first come to mind when you think of what your experience of going to ICOMOS was, or one lasting impression that has stayed with you. So if you could do that, I'll ask you, Louise, then Natali and Tristen, just to introduce yourself, tell us a tiny bit about yourself, and then just give us a snapshot of what you took away. And then we'll come around again and go a little bit deeper on the second scrape. Right, so Louise?
Okay, thank you. So I'm Louise Cooke. I'm a lecturer in building conservation at the University of York. So my focus is very much on materials and actually that relationship between materials and people. So my sort of message I took away from ICOMOS in Sydney is one of optimism, that heritage is challenged in a number of ways at the moment, but actually Sydney demonstrated some really sort of imaginative and creative ways in which heritage is being used in response to the climate crisis. Is that enough of the introduction bit, Lee?
I think it's great. And I want to say, Louise, Louise is zooming in from York. Are you correct? Are you in England at home at the moment?
I am. So I'm at home. It's 5:30 in the morning. So I have tea lined up beside me.
That's good. I'm going to say it's like York University, the university that never sleeps, right? That's what we'll hereafter refer to York as. So thank you so much for getting up at this hour and joining us. Okay, Natali, yeah.
Hi, thank you, Lee, and thank you, Nanda. So I'm Natali Pearson. I work at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre at the University of Sydney. So it's Friday afternoon where I'm dialing in from, Gadigal land, and I would like to also pay my respects to the custodians of this land and to elders past and present. So I think, so my research, first of all, I'm the water element here. I work on maritime heritage in Southeast Asia, and I'm particularly interested in shipwrecks in my research, their interpretation, their management, and how they're being used for the future in a geopolitical sense. So I think the one indelible moment that stayed with me from the conference, and actually Louise, Tristen and I have not coordinated this, so I'm very interested to see if we overlap or how we, kind of come together. But I think my one indelible moment was walking to register along Circular Quay up towards the Opera House. I'm born and bred in Sydney, and I was seeing Sydney through a different lens, through the lens of international visitors. And there were heritage banners, ICOMOS General Assembly heritage banners, the whole way up Circular Quay. And it was very exciting for me to see heritage on an international stage like that. Usually it's, I don't know, other tourist or economic initiatives that you see, or musicals, on those banners. So to see heritage showcased like that at one of our World Heritage sites was absolutely fantastic.
Okay, thanks very much, Natali, who I've known for about 5 years now, and Tristen. I think we met maybe last year or the year before, so it's wonderful to have you here in this context.
Thank you very much, Lee. Yes, I would also like to start with acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm zooming in from today, which is down in the Southern Highlands, which is the Gujungara peoples. I'm very happy to be here today and chat with you about ICOMOS and our collective experience. I am an academic fellow in the discipline of archaeology in the School of Humanities, and I'm an archaeologist and historian by training, and do a lot of work. I suppose I'm the earth component around cultural landscapes, in particular Australian Indigenous cultural landscapes and material culture and rock art and Indigenous archaeology. So I'm very fortunate to be able to work with a lot of communities in Australia and then also in the Pacific as well. I think, one thing that really, if I was going to say a key word, as Nanda sort of gave us a few little talking points, I think it would be empowerment and sovereignty would be my two words. I think one thing that was really unexpected and really welcomed was that ICOMOS really was a moment for Australian Indigenous heritage to be showcased, on a global scale. And also showcased locally to the general public, as Natali also touched on. And I think that that's something that was a real success of the conference, and really resonated with me, on a number of different levels and scales, which, hopefully we'll have a chance to chat about.
Okay, thanks, Tristen. So if I can, I tell you, I know nothing about heritage at all, although I used to share a corridor with some archaeologists. Alison Betts, always, she would seem to be like the Indiana Jones of the corridor. She was someone that lived to be doing field work, I think, and as like many Australian field archaeologists seem to do field work in arid lands, which I always find an interesting thing to think about. So what I thought I'd do first is, Louise, if you could just give us maybe tell us a little bit what ICOMOS is and how it works and what your relation has been to ICOMOS in the past, and then we can maybe build on it from there.
Yeah. So great, thank you very much. So ICOMOS refers to the International International Council on Monuments and Sites, and it was established in 1965. And the 1960s is a sort of important international moment in the building conservation movement. It's a moment when post-war there is an awareness of destruction and redevelopment and the impact of that on cultural heritage. And that arrives at the same time as a number of sort of big sort of national scale development projects, such as the building of the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. So the 1960s is a moment where international sort of conservation architects and archaeologists are coming together to sort of create some sort of response to this sense of change. And quite a lot of the conservation narrative comes out of this sense of endangerment and change. So the Venice Charter, which is the founding document of ICOMOS, is established in 1965. And this very much sets a direction of travel for ICOMOS for the sort of next sort of 20, 25 years. And the Venice Charter is very much critiqued as embodying a particular type of heritage, which has an emphasis on built structures, the built environment, and a sort of Western approach to conservation. So that Western approach to conservation, you can follow quite a close sort of narrative of that developing in the 19th century in relation to loss of particular Christian buildings, churches at that particular point. And it's that same idea that gets embedded within the ICOMOS founding documents. So the Venice Charter says things like, imbued with a message from the past, the historic monuments of generations of people remain to the present day as living witnesses of their age-old traditions. Now, unsurprisingly, the language of the Venice Charter and that particular emphasis on the built environment has been critiqued through time, and I'll come back and sort of pick up on where we are now with ICOMOS. So by 1972, ICOMOS becomes the advisor to UNESCO in relation to the World Heritage Convention. And again, this is important because it's that particular Western conservation emphasis that then becomes embedded within the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. And we've seen, again, it was quite a strong theme through the ICOMOS Sydney conference around those tensions of a sort of dichotomy between culture and nature, and a particular sort of tension around approaches to conservation. So through time then, ICOMOS has worked through different national committees. So each country can set up a national committee. As long as there are 3 members of ICOMOS, they can set up a national committee. And then there are international scientific committees that work alongside those as well. And within the context of the work that ICOMOS do for UNESCO, those national committees and scientific committees are providing advice to that process. So ICOMOS is one of the bodies, along with a conservation centre that is based in Italy, and IUCN, who are giving that sort of evaluation and guidance when applications are proposed to the World Heritage Convention. It's ICOMOS who will do the evaluation of the cultural properties, for example. So this all became sort of imbued and problematic through the 1980s and 1990s in relation to the perception that conservation did come from this sort of Western tradition, particularly focusing on stone-built ecclesiastical monuments. And that became entangled with ideas of what is heritage, and also entangled with ideas around what is authenticity and integrity. And those three concepts are key for the sort of operation of the World Heritage Convention. So after a bit of sort of thinking through and rethinking approaches, quite a lot of the innovation that ICOMOS has then taken on through the 1990s, the 2000s and onwards actually comes from the experience of ICOMOS in Australia. So ICOMOS Australia created their own conservation charter called the Borough Charter. And this is significant because it introduces the idea of cultural significance. So an awareness that heritage is so much more than that Western European canon. And I'm really, that there's a very nice sort of entanglement of the Australian heritage experience with the teaching that we do in York. So many of our sort of alumni from York came from Australia, studied for a 2-year conservation program in York, and then went back to Australia to put into practice some of those sort of teachings and learnings. And they established quite early on that some of that Western conservation approach just didn't work given the complexity of heritage in Australia. So one individual in particular, James Semple Kerr, who was a conservation architect, introduced this idea of cultural significance and the idea of the conservation plan as the sort of go-to approach, where you establish significance of a place, and that significance is then used for managing and conserving a place. So the first conservation plan is the conservation plan that's written for the Sydney Opera House, and it's that idea of significance and understanding significance as key for conservation that then gets embedded within the ICOMOS Borough Charter. And that is an Australian ICOMOS document that is used all the way around the world. It's been translated into many, many different languages. At the same time that ICOMOS are widening their definition of cultural significance, there are also some other sort of key sort of conferences that ICOMOS organise. So there is a conference in the 1990s on the idea of authenticity, and this happens in Nara in Japan. And this again redefines authenticity as a product of a particular place. It understands authenticity as something that is contextual, that relates both to place but also to the cultural practices that surround that place. And again, this new definition of authenticity is fundamental in widening our understanding of what heritage is, and allowing the UNESCO World Heritage Convention to then embrace different types of heritage. So, you know, ICOMOS is really important in terms of, you know, how we sort of develop the profession and what our practices now look like within conservation. ICOMOS also have a set of educational guidelines around conservation of cultural heritage. So it's that sort of guidelines that my own programmes here in York are sort of established against. So again, the ICOMOS sort of guidelines and conferences, they give frameworks for thinking around conservation and heritage. So that's the sort of background of what ICOMOS do. So my own involvement with ICOMOS has been both through the ICOMOS UK committee. So it's now 11 years ago, we organised a conference in the UK celebrating 40 years of the World Heritage Convention. Or was it 30? It's 40 years at that point. And then I'm quite actively involved in one of the international scientific committees on earth and architectural heritage. And that work, there's the sort of the work reviewing things like sites that are being nominated to the World Heritage Convention that have earth and architecture within them, and that's about 50% of the sites which are represented on the World Heritage List. But it's also thinking about initiatives around documentation of earth and architecture, establishing a glossary of terms, so that even though earth is present all the way around the world, we often use different terminologies for both so classifying different earth building technologies, and then for classifying different types of deterioration and loss that we see. So the ICOMOS scientific committees have been really thoughtful in researching particular challenges, coming up with these glossaries of terms. And again, we use those glossaries all the time when we're teaching. So there's a very well-established stone glossary. There is an earth building glossary that is in draft format. And, you know, I find that work really quite inspiring, because through those international scientific committees that have their own sets of conferences that happen in a separate year to the ICOMOS General Assembly conferences, that has again created those disciplines that surround those different materials, but also different types of heritage. So there's an underwater heritage, there's a space heritage, there's a cultural landscapes. And again, those individual scientific committees will be creating their own sort of charters or conventions, and again, creating those frameworks that other people will be working on around the world. So I have to say, when I set out on my own journey as an archaeologist that was interested in earth buildings, that then got involved in conservation of buildings, there aren't many sort of networks that encompass all of those different types of interest. And ICOMOS does do that through this sort of broad definition of heritage and through those sort of broad areas that they work as a scientific committee. The General Assembly that ICOMOS has happens every 3 or 4 years. And obviously the Sydney one was delayed due to COVID. The previous two were again quite similar, big international events. One was in Delhi, one was in Paris, and have a very similar sort of format. But I think that ICOMOS in Australia just did so much more in relation to that diversity of heritage, really drawing on the Indigenous experience of heritage, and really providing some really inspirational ideas as to how we move forward as a discipline. So that's a bit of an overview of ICOMOS. I'm very conscious that it's very early in the morning. I may have just completely garbled that as well. So I will pause for a moment now.
Okay, well, as a non-professional, can I say that was a fantastic overview? Really, really good. I feel already smarter than I was 20 minutes ago. That's just a revelation. There are just a few things that you said that really, oh, now I understand it. So some very 20th century frameworks that begin nationally, move internationally, but now have to extend to include underwater, the underwater, and space. So that's just, oh, I begin to understand how complex this is. We're going to come back with Tristen to think more about Indigenous knowledge and heritage. But I thought I'd ask Natali to speak a little bit, because whenever I said to someone else who was on the selection committee here that we were bringing you along, you know, that you would be part of the delegation, and they said, yeah, maritime heritage, that's a pretty, you know, that's a weird place to be. So I wondered if you had a perspective on ICOMOS from thinking about international waters, or maybe situations where the notion of authenticity isn't embedded in a shared context, but actually often a disputed context, or a context that's itself being contested. So, or anything else you'd like to tell us about yourself or about ICOMOS?
Sure. Thank you. Yes, just checking I'm not on mute. Louise, yes, I can go with Lee. That was a fantastic overview. Thank you. You've set us up so well for our discussion. And thank you for mentioning underwater cultural heritage. I am active on one of the international scientific subcommittees as well, but actually, interestingly, the International Committee on Underwater Cultural Heritage is overrepresented by Australia, so they're not taking any more applications. So I'm actually on the International Scientific Committee for Archaeological Heritage Management, and we're focusing our efforts at the moment in the working group that I'm part of on illicit trafficking of antiquities. But that overrepresentation of Australians in the Underwater Cultural Heritage Committee is actually not a surprise, because you know, we've talked about how these ecclesiastical monuments have led the World Heritage discussion for so long, and it took quite a long time for underwater cultural heritage to be considered as part of heritage and as part of World Heritage. And it was Australia that really led those discussions. Western Australia, in fact, had some of the world's first shipwreck legislation, and Australia had some of the world's first shipwreck legislation from a Commonwealth perspective back in the 70s with the Shipwrecks Act. In recent years, I think Australia has fallen behind when it comes to underwater cultural heritage in terms of keeping pace with the legislation. And it's only in recent years that we've introduced updated legislation that will position us to sign up for the 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. So we're still very active. We're on the Scientific Committee of Underwater Cultural Heritage, but the legislation has only just caught up and removed that final barrier to joining this other UNESCO convention that seeks to protect and preserve the world's underwater cultural heritage. And so even though I work on shipwrecks, when I talk about underwater cultural heritage, and I'm going to come to this, in my reflections on the ICOMOS GA, really importantly, underwater cultural heritage also includes things like submerged cultural landscapes, and that is a huge issue in Australian archaeology and heritage at the moment. I mentioned that the conference and that initial impression of seeing those heritage banners lining the foreshore, walking up to the Sydney Opera House, really brought home for me how this scientific symposium and General Assembly was an opportunity to showcase both Sydney and Australia on the world stage. Louise, I really appreciate you touching on the Borough Charter there. The opening ceremony was at the Sydney Opera House. There were performances from Australian opera singers. They had, I think, 6 or 8, nationally renowned opera singers performing for an absolutely full house. For many people, even fellow Sydney-siders, this was their first time inside that Dame Joan Sutherland Theatre. And there were also speeches. One of them was by Federal Minister Tanya Plibersek. She's Minister for Environment and Water, and heritage is part of her portfolio. And she spoke about the World Heritage listing of Murujuga, which I'll come back to in a moment. And she drew a connection between the bid for World Heritage recognition of the significance of this landscape and the Voice referendum, which seeks to recognise Indigenous peoples in the Australian Constitution. And at the time of recording this discussion, that referendum is yet to be held. It's happening tomorrow. But it was a really opportune moment for her to draw together those two, Murujuga and the Voice referendum, and recognising Indigenous heritage in Australia. Some of the other things that took place at this conference that were all about showcasing us and our heritage on the world stage was that the Royal Australian Mint minted a coin in the honour of the conference. Fantastic. And it showcases all of Australia's 20 World Heritage sites. And I think there should be a prize for someone who can name all of them. And this has really set the bar for whoever holds the next ICOMOS. Let me tell you, fancy minting a coin in honour of a conference. It was astounding. There were also side events and day trips. So many of the delegates had the opportunity to go to the Blue Mountains. And there was also a side event to Luna Park, where the Luna Park was lit up in green, the colour of ICOMOS, and all the rides were free. And that was a great opportunity to see some of the conveners, usually very serious academics, letting their hair down on some of the rides. So from an international perspective, we had Sydney in Australia, the Borough Charter, this amazing coin, the Sydney Opera House. From an international perspective, my attendance at this conference was also an opportunity to support my Indonesian colleagues and my collaborations in Southeast Asia. Because of the support through SSSHARC and, what are we calling it, CHCI, the Consortium of Humanities Centres and Institutes, I was able to offer my registration to my Indonesian colleague, which was honestly a remarkable opportunity. She is a maritime archaeologist and museum curator in Jakarta, and she's now a PhD candidate on a project at Flinders University. So seeing Sydney through her eyes was wonderful, but also going around the conference and thinking about things together with her from an Indonesian maritime archaeology perspective was a great privilege. And I'm really grateful to SSSHARC for that, and to the consortium for that opportunity. Now, the other thing this conference did was to showcase significant Australian heritage sites. including those yet to be listed. So I mentioned Murujuga, and there was a full day prior to the workshop, prior to the conference, on the Murujuga cultural landscape. And the Murujuga cultural landscape is 100,000 hectares of remote land and sea country in the Pilbara. And it's been nominated by Australia for World Heritage listing, and the evaluation by the UNESCO World Heritage Centre is expected to commence next year. I didn't have the opportunity to attend that workshop because I had other conference commitments, but it's worth mentioning because Murujuga is not only about the petroglyphs, so the rock art engravings, of which there are estimated to be between 1 and 2 million, but because, as Minister Plibersek noted, the petroglyphs travel across the land and down onto the ocean floor, dating back to a period when the seabed was still dry land before the oceans had risen. And so archaeologists, including some of my colleagues, have mapped out these underwater sites. In 2021, the Deep History of Sea Country project team uncovered a new intertidal stone quarry and stone tool manufacturing site, as well as coastal rock art and engravings as part of their land and sea archaeological survey off the Pilbara coastline. Importantly, this is also cultural knowledge held by Indigenous elders, so it's not just being mapped scientifically by archaeologists. It's deeply held through oral traditions and the passing down of this knowledge by Indigenous elders who live there. So what we saw with the Murujuga showcase, and this is my segue to talking about maritime heritage, but it was also a focus on the power and the significance of Indigenous heritage in Australia, and the importance of Indigenous knowledge in managing and understanding this heritage. And of course, I have raised it because of the maritime heritage element as well. And this was something, that I felt was somewhat missing at the ICOMOS GA. So there was the Murujuga showcase in the workshop the day before. But in terms of the papers that were presented at the General Assembly, there were only a limited number of papers on maritime heritage. The conference program was huge, and I may have missed them. There were over 1,400 delegates at this conference. But if you do a word search of the conference, there are very few mentions of maritime heritage. So there's still a lot of work to do, I think, in understanding the significance of maritime heritage and, including these discussions about submerged cultural landscapes as part of our thinking about what heritage is. So, yeah, I think I'll just wrap up by saying that we need to understand and manage this underwater cultural heritage through local and national environments, and to include consideration of Australia's coasts, intertidal zones, rivers, lakes, and other submerged environments as part of our thinking about what constitutes heritage.
Thanks, Natali. That's fantastic. And I think you're doing my work for me because you seem to have set up a perfect throw forward to Tristen there. So I'll just let Tristen take it up. Right.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, thanks so much for that, Nat. Yeah, I mean, one of the highlights, I think same with Lou, just the opportunity to reaffirm. I really feel like that the General Assembly was a reaffirmation of all of the strengths that historically Australia ICOMOS has sort of contributed to the global conversation in relation to, social value, documenting social value, the role of intangible cultural heritage, in underpinning social value and authenticity and the continuation of cultural practice by, the communities who are attached to heritage places. And, I previously haven't had very much interaction with ICOMOS because of the sort of historical stereotyping of it being really dominated by built heritage, not really a community of practice that a lot of people who working in cultural landscapes with First Nations communities interact with, in a really intense sort of sphere, because obviously, within communities of practice, there are different representative bodies and disciplinary sort of centres of specialisation that have their own conferences and their own sort of research outputs and conversations, and youth forums, Indigenous Ranger youth forums, native title, IATSIS-led sort of initiatives have been, as well as, the National Body for Australian Archaeology and Cultural Heritage, have been sort of the places where I have, focused my efforts for sort of engaging and presenting research. So this was actually my first ICOMOS conference, and I came into it potentially, a little bit skeptical, I suppose, around the role that ICOMOS could play, I suppose, in being a real active mechanism or portal by which Indigenous heritage could be, effectively communicated. But I was really just blown away by how strong the Indigenous heritage scientific symposium was, but also the range of public outreach and engagement events, like Natali was saying, at Sydney Opera House, for example, they also had the Badjagilly Light Show. They had, a public heritage lecture, which had, 6 First Nations speakers, talking about, living heritage, sites, objects, language, plants and sky, which really positioned Australian Aboriginal heritage within a global context, and presenting it, at a really pivotal moment, as everyone has already touched on, with the upcoming Voice referendum, to showcase the interconnectedness of living cultural heritage and living cultural landscapes, and the link between heritage, sovereignty, social justice, all of these really big issues that are front of mind, front of centre in Australian public culture at the moment. And what was really refreshing to see was that, as a non-Indigenous researcher, was that actually, First Nations and Indigenous peoples were the experts in these Indigenous heritage sessions. They were the speakers, they were the scientists and practitioners, as well as the traditional knowledge holders. And so, they were the owners and the decision, involved in the decision making in the heritage around their own heritage. It was really evident to see participating and listening, just sitting back and observing in these in the scientific symposium, that actually Indigenous people are leading and directing the conversation. And I think that that was really refreshing, when there have been and continue to be a lot of conversations had around the management of Indigenous heritage that sometimes don't necessarily always include First Nations people, and those conversations are not necessarily always led by the Indigenous communities who they impact and affect. So, in addition to Murrujuga Cultural Symposium, they ran, touching on Louise's conversations around climate, a Caring for Country workshop that was co-hosted again by Australia ICOMOS and the Australian Museum, and sponsored by the Getty Conservation Institute, around, often, that it's Indigenous people and First Nations communities who are working at the forefront of climate crisis and the impacts of that on heritage, and their intangible cultural heritage, their ability to continue cultural practices. This is something I think that, we're very cognizant of, being in Australia and embedded within the broader Pacific. But, it was, again, just something that really signalled, an avenue for, agency, for the amplification of Indigenous voices within, an official ICOMOS, UNESCO sort of sanctioned setting, which again was, I think, really important. I mean, one of the other things which was really just such an inspiring event to sort of be a part of was the Youth Forum, which took place on Cockatoo Island on the weekend before the official opening of the General Assembly. And that was for young people, future and current, youth practitioners in heritage from around the world, camped out on Cockatoo Island for the weekend before the opening of the General Assembly. And a University of Sydney was involved in the event, a number of different academics and schools, and I was privileged enough to work alongside some of the Indigenous mentors in the School of Humanities. And what we did was do a workshop where we wanted to really bring together people's experiences of how, marginalized communities can sort of build, practical and applied solutions to sort of push a counter narrative for how heritage sites are managed, interpreted, and communicated. And what it was really, inspiring to see, young delegates who are practitioners or the future practitioners in heritage from around the world come together and bring sort of different examples from, New Zealand, Australia, Sri Lanka, together to really come back to a key point. And that was that the voices and the needs of the communities, and whether that be First Nations or not, really as the primary stakeholders need to be taken into consideration when stewarding and caring and managing heritage. And I think that's a really important takeaway, looping back to the Burra Charter and the idea of cultural significance and social value and the power of heritage. I think moving forward as we move into really, this week is a really good example of sort of the really difficult global situation that we all are working within and living within, is that it comes back to that commonality of experience and that the human connection and the social value that underpins heritage. And I mean, the other thing which was just so inspiring was the key opening address by June Oscar, AO. It really set the tone for the entire week, I think, and the real strength of ICOMOS, in my opinion. And that was coming back to sovereignty for Indigenous people, that heritage and heritage systems really are supported and embedded within this broader regime of land ownership, of the right to practice continual cultural practice, the right to equity, to a more inclusive and sustainable future, not just for First Nations communities and individuals, but for all Australians. So I mean, I think there were so many highlights for me. The scientific symposium and the papers that I observed was so broad and diverse in their gamut, covering topics from, the healing power of truth-telling, Indigenous-led, holistic heritage management practices, which, you know, again, coming back to Lou's topic of nature versus culture and the tension there, you know, Indigenous ontological approaches to managing heritage landscapes, but also not just from an Australian perspective. You know, there were you know, presentations there from the Americas, New Zealand, you know, First Nations communities from Nepal, and you know, I think I'll leave it there, and try and sort of think about, you know, that the commonality point really was that, you know, the showing of strength was really, you know, how far Indigenous communities have come in their fight to amplify their voices and assert agency, but also, you know, that there was still such a great need for change and to move forward, and it was just so refreshing to see, you know, ICOMOS play you know, to function as a vehicle and mechanism for the empowerment of those First Nations voices and concerns.
Thank you so much, Tristen. That was just, you know, really inspiring. I had no idea that heritage could, you know, I have a kind of antiques roadshow notion of what heritage is. Like, so to hear you present heritage as this extraordinary rubric that can do so many things for so many people, I find that very inspiring. So, you know, I used to struggle. I only really recently encountered the term intangible heritage, and I had to think very hard about what that was. But you also, I think you use the term attachment, that it's people's, it's you know, generational attachments to things and places and ways of living that we might be thinking about here. And obviously we're thinking about those in Australia in relation to rising sea levels and to increased fire. So that's the other element that, you know, we haven't talked about here. But so I'd just like to give you a moment to respond to each other, and maybe think too that you're all involved in the mission of training up the next generation of heritage scholars and heritage practitioners and professionals. And I wondered if you could think about how you think their careers might be different than there, or how they might understand what the shape their career might take as they move forward in this kind of, with this kind of new expanded understanding of what heritage might be. So you can just jump in as you wish.
I'll jump in. You know, just quickly. I often wrestle with this question of what we're doing with heritage as heritage practitioners or professionals, and often find myself justifying the work we do within the context of these massive problems that our world is facing. And this week has been a real doozy for that. But then, you know, I don't think we've mentioned what the focus of the 2023 ICOMOS GA was, and it was heritage changes, resilience, responsibility, rights, and relationships. So if you think about heritage within this rubric, as you've just mentioned, Lee, you know, it's not about, gosh, I don't watch Antiques Roadshow, but it's not about dusty whalebones and like keeping things for the sake of it. It really is about interrogating our relationship with the past so that we can shape our future. And you know, you mentioned intangible heritage, and that is such a big consideration with all types of heritage that we're all interested in, whether it's shipwrecks or petroglyphs or you know, German cathedrals. I'm not saying that's what you're interested in, Louise, but you know, it's about our relationship with these sites, these places, and the identities we sort of configure from and around this heritage. So, you know, for the next generation of heritage practitioners, I would really hope they continue to engage with these issues around resilience, responsibility, rights, and relationships with each other and with our world. Oh, you're on mute, Lee.
All right,
Sorry.
no, thank you. And I know, Louise, one of the reasons we had, there were some really strong applications for the CHCI funding here, but one of the things that made your application stand out is that you mentioned that you already had some early career researchers traveling to Australia and you wanted to travel with them. So I think that's the same thing, that in a way we thought, no, there was a cohort or a community, you already had a community of practice. So I wonder what you think the impact of this conference was on that micro community.
Yeah, so I had one of my students was in Sydney, and another was not able to travel, but I presented their research. And for both individuals, one from Algeria, one from Kerala, they have undertaken their research today within a COVID environment, so they've missed that opportunity to network. And what they sort of came away from sort of either listening in to the stream or actually physically being there and meeting people was just an ability to contextualize their work within this global perspective on what is happening within sort of culture and heritage, culture and nature. And both have sort of come away with much better networks, but also realizing, that there are spaces that they want to move into. And we have very much come through, I always talk to my students about it as a social turn in heritage. It's not about objects or things or places, it's about people. And I think that just shone through so strongly through the few days in Sydney. And what I realise now, I've been teaching heritage now for quite a long time, and no longer do our generations coming through, they don't say, oh, I'm really interested in Victorian buildings, or I'm really interested in Georgian buildings, I'm really interested in 1920s petrol stations, or whatever it might be. It's about everything. It's about place, it's about people, it's about social value. And there's some fantastic parallels of that social turn everywhere within the heritage sector. So that is what the next generation will be working on. And that skills we have as heritage practitioners, it doesn't matter what type of heritage we're working on. It's that toolkit approach that we have. And Sydney was just a fantastic demonstration of that toolkit works across the world and across different types of heritage, I think.
Thank you so much for that. One of the things I'm observing is that we didn't know you before September, Louise, and now I see everyone's calling you Lou, but that social turn, I think that certainly at SSSHARC, that's what we try and like to think that we do, that we curate, we curate activities, but really it's about the culture that we build here. So I like to hear that again there. So it's wonderful that you can do this. Is there anything else, Tristen, you'd like to end on if you were?
Yeah, I feel like my, little summary was really upbeat. There are real serious concerns, for, the safeguarding of Indigenous heritage in an Australian context, which were really discussed, quite rigorously in the Indigenous sessions. We had, Rachel Perkins, rallying a call for arms for the reform for First Nations heritage protections in Australia and the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance, following Juukan Gorge. And obviously there's been a repeal of state legislation in Western Australia, and so I think there were and same with talking about climate change and climate impacts, there were really robust discussions around really big problems which are so nuanced and complex and beyond the scope of heritage. But I think one thing that, came through still at the end was that there was still hope for, people working together and the capacity of heritage to bring people together because of that, you know, universal attachment and social value that everyone feels when thinking through, you know, their particular attachment to places and spaces and their intangible cultural heritage practice. You know, it comes back to that core unique, I suppose, element of humanness. And I think that was something that, you know, at the end of the conference, all of the delegates potentially felt reinvigorated after, you know, some pretty dark days in terms of and some internal sort of critique and critical reflection, you know, following Black Lives Matter movements, from COVID, you know, from where we are right now, you know, war, displacement of peoples, you know, in really precarious sort of situations. And I think still at the end of the conference, everyone sort of felt, I mean, I sort of felt that, you know, within the broader scope of the conference, that people felt renewed and emboldened and impassioned to sort of keep working. And I think that I didn't expect that. So yeah, I don't know how Nat and Lou felt about that at the end, but I was like, yeah, you know, this is great. The future is challenging, but the future is also bright, you know? Yeah.
Natali?
Yeah, sure. Look, I've been reflecting a lot this week on the privileges I have of living on Gadigal land and of having electricity and water and healthcare and education, and, you know, minimal threat of terrorist violence. So I don't think my message is as upbeat as yours, Tristen. You know, I think there was a lot of consideration at the GA and the Scientific Symposium about why heritage matters. But what I would like to see in the future, what really piques my interest and makes it, you know, a problem I want to keep rubbing over between my fingers is thinking about heritage in a way that does not assume that it's benevolent or beneficial. I think there's an assumption that World Heritage listing and heritage generally is a good thing. It's something to aspire to, it's something to achieve, or it's something to protect. But I was really fascinated by Lynn Meskel's keynote at the end of the Scientific Symposium, in which she looked at the recurrence of violence in the lead up to and post World Heritage listing. And she's doing this multidisciplinary project using huge data sets where they've been able to track spikes in violence associated with when World Heritage listing is coming up, when it takes place, and in the aftermath. So I'm really interested in that idea of heritage as not something that is necessarily benevolent. And I'd really like to see this idea of the risks and damage stemming from heritage, you know, and this ardent pursuit of identity through heritage, percolating through, you know, the next ICOMOS GA and some of those discussions.
Yeah, hideously, I think you will be right, Natali. My prediction is that ICOMOS, the next, you know, rubric could well be heritage in a time of terror. And I noticed too that, Louise, when I look at your CV and before you were at York, a lot of the work you've done has been in the Middle East and in Lebanon and post the Civil War, when just the hideous devastation that's wreaked on intangibly and tangibly generates new possibilities for heritage. So it's an extremely complicated field. So I think, given that you gave us such a beautiful overview at the beginning, I wondered if we could give you the chance to, you know, to give us some closure or to maybe understanding all that, to return us to that sense of hope that Tristen talked about. That's a big ask, I know.
Yeah, that's a big ask at this time in the morning. Yeah, I have been very privileged to be able to work all the way around the world, and I have I have been able to sort of take part in that social turn in different ways. I think heritage is complicated, it is conflicted, but that social turn gives us a framework and a lens for understanding both the positive and the complexity that surrounds our sort of professional practice and our sort of academic research. I do an activity with my students in York where I ask them to critique the 24 names of individuals who were there signing the founding document for ICOMOS, the Venice Charter. And it is 24 males based in Western Europe. And if we now look forward to 2023 and the fact there were 1,400 heritage practitioners and researchers from all the way around the world, that shows the journey that the discipline has gone on. The discipline still has a lot further to go on that journey. I mean, I'm so privileged and so thankful that I got the opportunity to come to Sydney, but I have to say Sydney did not need more white women in their 40s present. So I hope that in the next iteration of the ICOMOS General Assembly, that work on positive impact, increasing the diversity across the discipline, across the profession continues. And I think we've got some really good examples of how we can work to have positive impact. So I will probably be a woman in my 50s at the next ICOMOS General Assembly. So I'll be pushing the boundaries in different ways. But yeah, I just hope that we continue to have that positive impact and increase the representation of people working in the sector.
That's an absolute fabulous gift of closure on this beautiful sunny Friday afternoon in Sydney. So I'd just like to thank all of you for what I think has been a really compelling conversation. So I hope that our friends in the Consortium for Humanities and centres and institutes are pleased with us, because I think they spent some very good coin, if not the largest coin in Sydney, on bringing you all together. And Louise, you're very welcome at SSHARC anytime. And anybody else listening who would like to come and work with Natali or Tristen, please look into our fellowship programs. That's what they're designed for, to bring people from around the world or around Australia here. Also, we have a First Nations fellowship program. Anyone that would like to come here and work with Natali or Tristen, please look into that. All right. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.